Good afternoon and welcome to this episode of Nucleus Investment Insights, War and Wealth, Investing for the New Age of Conflict. Conflict has been an essential part of the human condition since the first caveman hit the second caveman over the head with a club for his property. It has evolved significantly since then, but at its core, it is still the use of violence in an attempt to resolve a conflict of desires. One of the significant evolutions has occurred as a result of capitalism. This has raised military and defense industries, created economic impacts of warfare, and seen the birth of the military-industrial complex, to name just a few. It's a divisive and extraordinarily nuanced topic, but the reality we face as investors is that we have the ability to benefit from it. And today we're going to look at how modern warfare is evolving and where the opportunities to profit are. An important part of Nucleus Wealth DNA is respecting different points of views on issues. It's the very reason our clients invest through their own individual accounts and are able to personalise those with more than 80 different screens and tilts, of which some are related to the issues we will be discussing today. Given I have the pleasure of hosting this episode, I'd like to start by saying I find armed conflict horrifying, but the issue of warfare is complicated and nuanced and appears to be tied to the human condition. The experience of investors protesting through lack of investment in the cluster munitions industry proves the challenges people face when using their investments to try and enact change. Cluster munitions continue to be produced to this day, just not by listed companies, and they continue to be used in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So wherever you stand on warfare and investing in it, I am sure you will find today's episode enlightening. I am Shelley George, Chief Operating Officer at Nucleus Wealth, and I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to welcome Nucleus Wealth's Chief Investment Officer, Damien Klassen, who's going to help us unpick this very interesting and nuanced issue. Welcome, Damien.
Thanks, Shelley.
So just a reminder that the information in this podcast is general in nature and it does not take into account your personal situation. If you do want to discuss your personal financial situation, you can go to our website at nucleuswealth.com/contact and you can book a call with our Senior Financial Advisor, Samuel Kerr, to have a no obligation chat. All right, Damien, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick us off here.
Yeah, sure. So what I want to run through a bunch of different things. We'll start with some of the ethical considerations, but I want to also sort of give a quick background as to what's been happening, particularly in the last week or so, the geopolitical implications, the macroeconomic implications, because that's sort of a separate part from what what you can actually invest in terms of what we've seen in coming from the Ukraine war, and regardless of your ethical sort of feeling about war, that's going to make a difference to your portfolio. And then finally, have a run through what are some of the military changes we've seen from the Ukraine war, because what we've seen a whole bunch of different countries come out with white papers and quite significantly change their defense budgets over the last year or so. And so I really want to sort of delve into that and what that means for various companies and what the stock implications are for that entire sector. So so lots of different things to sort of tick off on.
Let's get into it.
Yeah, so let's start with the ethical considerations. You touched on their cluster munitions, and I just want to give sort of, I guess this is part of the issue that I want to raise for how, you spoke about how we deal with these, is we hand the power back to investors to say, what do you want to do in terms of and
by when you mean Nucleus Wealth?
Nucleus Wealth, yeah, hand it back to investors, say, okay, rather than we're just going to blanket cut out a whole bunch of things, we're actually going to let clients sort of make that decision for their own portfolio. And part of that reason comes because excluding things from portfolios can make a difference, and in a way, it's sort of cluster munitions is a good example of how it genuinely made a difference to listed companies, but it can also end up with just pushing the problem somewhere else. which is exactly what's happened here. So
and we've
10
seen
years.
that elsewhere as well. I just wanted to jump in there and say that cluster munitions is, in my mind, not a unique case. Obviously, fossil fuel production is very topical these days, and we saw BHP relatively recently sell their oil and gas assets to Woodside Petroleum. So now BHP looks like it's clean, but the assets continue to be produced.
Yeah, well, and though at least in that case, it's still to another listed company. So what's happened with cluster munitions was the UN basically banned them and passed a motion to which a whole bunch of people jumped on and signed to say that cluster munitions shouldn't be produced. And these are munitions which basically the first bomb goes out, and then a whole bunch more sort of all scatter from that, and they can last for years. And so. So 10 years ago, I was covering at Schroders, sort of looking at this. There's a lot of firms around the world, want to invest in companies that are ex-cluster munitions. And so the US is not a signatory, China's not a signatory, Russia's not a signatory. Some of the three of the biggest militaries out there aren't signatories. Most of the world is a signatory to that. But what that ended up meaning is that all the companies that used to do it have one by one sort of ticked off and are no longer doing it. But you can read, any day about analysis of what's going on in the Ukraine, and you can see that they're actively being used by both sides in terms of there's a common one the US in particular, or the Ukraine, is using, which is US munitions, which is they'll attack a position. As the defenders try to flee, they'll throw out these bombs that then scatter landmines everywhere, which then prevents them from fleeing. And so as a military concept, you can see the benefits to it. But what tends to happen is those landmines in 10, 20 years' time will still be there, and there'll be kids and cows and farmers, stepping over them, and that's why the signatory. So by moving it out of listed companies, it has helped in some extent, but the flip side is it's just appeared. In a way, we've swept that problem under the carpet. So that's the first part. The second part, though, is on the ethical side is there's definitely an issue that we have in terms of saying. So on the positive side, you go, well, look. There are aggressors out there. Somebody needs to produce these weapons. If nobody produced weapons, then the Ukraine would have been overrun because the rest of the world wouldn't have had any weapons to give to the Ukraine to defend themselves. So there's a big tick on that side. The problems come from I think the big ethical problem for me comes from the thought that the military industrial complex is very large, and they do have a significant number of lobbyists. And the question is, are they actually putting people into power by funding people who are particularly who are warmongers and who are particularly hawkish in terms of these? And so there are genuine ethical considerations, and I can't tell you what in which case what weighs up more than the other case. That's sort of for people to make their own minds up.
Can I just ask on that one, can you quickly define what the military industrial complex is for any of those like myself might not fully understand it?
Yeah, well, it's effectively that there are paid lobbyists, particularly in the US, and who will donate to politicians' campaigns and donate big amounts, and that gets them access, and that gets them, I guess that gets them access to help drive policy, but potentially it gets them access to. And there was a lot of, in particular, in the Bush years, there was a lot of complaints that that they were embarking upon wars because they were funded so much by the military-industrial complex, and a lot of members would end up going to work in jobs after they'd left politics in working for these companies and sitting on boards and those types of factors. And so there's definitely ethical issues on both sides.
So the lobbyists, they're paid by the companies that are producing these arms and benefiting from warfare. Is that right?
Yep. And so sometimes they're industry groups in terms of it's just everyone chips in and helps to fund, and sometimes it'll be individual companies that are helping to push policy in the direction that they want.
Before we move on, I just actually wanted to make the point that I think this idea of lobbyists is really interesting and far-reaching. I know in Australia, David Pocock has recently raised the issue of basically parliamentarians can let lobbyists into Parliament House, so the lobbyists can then go and lobby everyone that they want to lobby. It might not have anything to do with their particular portfolio, but there is no public record of which parliamentarian has let in which lobbyists, and David Pocock is suggesting that there should be a public record of that, which I think is certainly an interesting idea. And I guess it goes to another one of Nucleus Wealth's core tenets of this idea of transparency can bring about I don't know what's the word, not responsibility, but oversight and some degree of control. When you can see what's happening, you have the ability to act on it.
Yeah, that's right. And there's that overarching issue by if you say, okay, I'm not going to invest in any of these companies, has that solved the problem that we're actually still letting these companies in and lobby to parliamentarians and push issues? I think the answer is quite firmly a no on that point at the moment.
Certainly not if you're investing in them in the secondary market. That has very little impact.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump into the actual thing and talk about what the implications are. So last weekend there was an attempted coup within Russia. So the Wagner Group, which is notionally a private military company within Russia. I think I can go through a lot of the back history, but I'll probably do the broad overview and I'll let people dig in elsewhere. But effectively, a private military company in a plausible deniability, with plausible in inverted commas, and I guess lots of inverted commas, because I think there's most people treat them as an arm of the Russian government, or treated them as an arm of the Russian government, and it was really there as a sort of bit of a fig leaf, if you wanted to sort of say, I'd really like to do something with the Russian government. Well, I'd really like to do something with the Russian government or with Wagner, and I'll use this thin veneer of no, they're a separate person to committing if this Wagner's committing war crimes or doing things that are particularly distasteful. I could still deal with the Russian government because I'm calling them separate entities. That is, and Wagner sort of started. It's been quite active in terms of the Donbass or the Ukraine in the past, in Syria, in Mali, in the Central African Republic, a whole bunch of other different countries where there've been discussions about coming in to help prop up dictators or to whatever it is, and whoever it is they need taken out. That's where sort of Wagner's been involved. Now, the issue then comes back to saying, okay, they've been through this process where they've been fighting within the Ukraine. They had, as part of doing that, they also initially got to go into prisons and bring in a lot of convicts, and the way it was described, to boost their numbers, and the way it was, most sort of military analysts would describe it is Wagner has a core force of soldiers who are highly trained and very effective relative to the rest of the US, the rest of the Russian military, but also very brutal and accused of war crimes in many countries that they've been involved in, and famous for sort of killing their own deserters with sledgehammers. So a very brutal group, and they brought on a lot of soldiers. They used a lot of convicts. They used a lot of those convicts as pretty much as cannon fodder in a lot of attack. They lost a lot of people themselves. So the Wagner group itself, Prigozhin admitted to 10,000 of his own troops and 10,000 convicts. Sort of more independent observers would suggest that the 10,000 of his own troops is probably about right, but the 10,000 convicts is probably a vast underestimation of how many convicts actually died, sort of as part of his groups.
Why would he underestimate that?
Well, yeah, for a couple of reasons. One is to make sure he's still getting more convicts coming on, I suppose. Secondly, I guess if you're going to underplay a certain amount of deaths, so I think both sides are guilty of underplaying how many deaths there's been, and if you're going to underestimate it by a certain amount, I don't know why he chose to do it in that way. Because I think what happened was the independent people went if you look at the ratio of his total forces to the number of that died, it was sort of almost 50% of his experienced forces look like they've died or been injured in contact, and so then to say that only 20% of the convicts did seems like an unrealistic
given their
expectation.
tactics,
especially. So it might just be he hadn't sort of thought through what he was displaying. Okay, so that's then as they were withdrawing from Bakhmut, there's been he made allegations that they'd run into a minefield which was designed to actually destroy his troops, and at the same time the Russian military were firing upon him. So he's basically saying that he was attacked by his own side, and he took a senior colonel prisoner as part of that, and then he claims he was attacked again. Now that's quite possible that this is true. It might be made up as well, but it's not unknown within militaries to have these types of conflicts. Even in places like the Japanese military from the Second World War, the army and navy hated each other and quite often were assassinating senior members of each other's. So and Hitler set up his two armies as with a certain amount of conflict, or sort of internal competition as well. So so I guess what I'm saying is it's not unknown. It is possible that he was attacked. It's possible he made up certain elements of it as well. But he's then started the coup. Now the question is, the first thing people say, well, was it real? Is this a ploy? Is he trying to get troops somewhere else? I think given the time Putin took to respond to it, given that Wagner shot down a number of aircraft within in terms of that were attacking their convoy, I think it does look as if it was pretty real. Now the question is, why was he doing it? Was he looking for a bribe? Is this a retirement plan? Because it looked like he was trying to be forced under the rest of the military, and given how much how vehemently opposed and how outspoken he'd been, he potentially looked upon that as a death sentence, and he looked. This was a retirement plan for him to get some sort of bribe. Potentially, it was overconfidence. Potentially, he genuinely thought he'd pick up enough support as he went that generals would defect and come to his side. So that was sort of a potential as well. So that's a little bit of the background. So it is worth saying Wagner doesn't have a air force. It does have a lot of heavy equipment from sourced from Russia. They've been embedded in Russia for basically since inception. So they're in Russia. They get Russian equipment. Their headquarters are close to military headquarters. They're very close with all these other ones. The idea of them being separate was very much I think it's pretty close to a fiction. And Russia's now actually taken credit for just today. They're actually taking credit for Wagner over the last year and trying to move all the troops under their own official command. Does that mean they're also taking credit for the war crimes that have happened? I don't know. It
doesn't matter though. I mean, you don't find that war crimes get punished.
Get prosecuted anyway. Well, yeah, that's add it to the list, I guess, in terms of what's going on in the Ukraine. But I guess so. We have this background of this coup going on, and quite a dramatic change in terms of. I don't want to underplay how much of a change this is within Russia. Is that Putin was looked upon as being quite impregnable in terms of his position, and very much in terms of dictators with power. He's potentially the richest person in the world. He's got these massive oil revenues and seemed to have a hold within Russia that was hard to deny. So this has put a major dent in terms of his what he's looking at. The issue is in terms of the real geopolitical issues that come up from this, though, is it creates internal issues in Russia. And so are we going to see more jockeying for position? Are we going to see other people rise up? Don't know, but it's certainly the odds of it today are much higher than they were versus 2 weeks ago. That you're going to start to see competitors to Putin. His position is significantly weaker. Gone from what would have been thought as impregnable to now seems mortal. And will you see more internal issues within Russia? Quite possibly. External interference is another one. So they are heavily involved in a number of different countries, including Syria and Mali and Central African Republic. Will there be less of that? Quite possibly. I mean, they're trying to bring the Wagner forces under the Russian military now within those countries. Will some of them retire and quit? Will they manage to do it? Won't they? Will they be able to? They no longer have the thin veneer of no, this isn't Russia. It's a private military company doing something. So there's potentially less that they can get away with in terms of interference. So that probably does mean sort of more instability. Wagner was also believed to have been running a lot of the troll farms within Russia. So
what's a troll farm?
Troll farm where you basically psychological warfare where you jump on and you try and rile up Americans to hate each other. So you jump on there and complain about on the internet, jump on and make comments about whatever on YouTube's and Facebook and all that type of stuff, and try and encourage people to dislike each other. And so, and very effectively with some of those, there's a reasonable argument that there's a reason, at least some of the increasing divide in the American society is being heavily encouraged by Russia and aided by the trolls. So the question is now, though, if you're a paid troll at one of these places and you used to work for the Wagner Group, now you've got a new boss. You used to have to go out and write 50 comments a day on various things about complaining about, say, 30 or 40 of them in America and 20 or 30 of them in Europe and other areas. Maybe you got to halve your amount to both America and Europe, and now you got to write a bunch back to Russia to try and help prop up Putin. So there's certainly issues in terms of is there, on one side there's potentially more instability, but on the flip side maybe there's less interference by Russia in other people's in other countries' affairs and political systems because there's more instability in their own country.
And what do you think are the implications of that increased instability? Because it sounds like there were quite a few regions there that were relatively not well-off economies.
Yeah, well, the economic and so from a big picture, from a global perspective, there's actually not a lot in terms of those. Most of these are very small countries and with very small economies, and really not a lot of trade with other partners. And so the overall effect is not much. I think there's, in terms of you'd probably expect there to be a short-term increase in instability. Maybe there's a longer term more stability. I guess the optimist would say there's if not as many dictators are propped up, but then again maybe it just means it breaks into more war because so I think that's sort of I think that's unknowable.
Right.
So
in
an ideal world,
interference could be actually a bigger thing. Like maybe it changes the odds of Donald Trump winning the next election.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, and I guess possibly something like you might consider this, say, for Iraq as an example of saying, okay, Saddam Hussein had a lot of faults and a lot of was guilty of a lot of things, but the country was relatively stable while he was there. Regardless of all the crimes and everything he was going on with. When he was no longer there, it broke down into civil war and significant problems for decades beyond that. So I guess it's the same argument for a lot of the countries they're in. If you're propping up a dictator, is that notionally it seems like a bad thing as a start, but maybe things can always get worse. So
it's less bad. Yep.
Yeah. The other things is there's probably some more instability though to come from, I guess, what you'd call implied protection. So as an example, Armenia and Azerbaijan, are fighting over particular areas. Armenia is widely thought to be supported, or is supported by Russia, and so Azerbaijan's probably been more limited than what they might have been. Will they now look upon that as being, okay, Russia's no longer the protectorate they once were? Maybe we can do more while they're distracted internally and distracted in the Ukraine. So maybe you do see more instability sort of break out in various countries. And the bigger issue, obviously, is nuclear weapons. Is that we have is that Russia has a lot of them, and for anyone who might have been, I guess, celebrating the fact that he is he's a competitor to Putin and his regime for the last 20 years, would not have want to see some guy who's famous for war crimes and for killing people with sledgehammers if they desert his army in charge of any amount of nuclear weapons. So there's certainly big issues from a stability and world stability point of view.
To me, there's that side of it, and then there's the other side of it, in which kind of, even from the start of this war, there was concerns where if you backed Putin into a corner where he looked like he couldn't win, that increased the risk around nuclear detonation.
Weapons. And maybe, and there's a reasonable argument that it has increased. Just the coup against it. Maybe he needs to use them to
yeah. It
to
certainly
sure
feels like, I think you said it's decreased, or he's
the stakes have risen.
Yeah,
the stakes have risen. Yes. So some of the other things I just wanted to highlight. There's a good comment from I've forgotten what he's actually, Thomas Graham. I've forgotten he's a defence expert somewhere, but his comment that I quite liked was that any Russian leader must be able to do three things to keep the confidence of the elites and the people who are supporting him. One is protect them from external enemies. Secondly is protect them from the Russian people themselves, and third, protect them from each other. And arguably that's where Putin's gone from being very successful at all three of those to actually, on two of them in particular, the external enemies and from each other, he seems to be failing. And the concern is, that maybe he can't protect them from the Russian people next. I've got a table I just wanted to pop up as part of that. Now, this is all speculation and everything like that, but it's about, a number of newspapers have run this story. Wikipedia's got a list of 35 sort of billionaires and Russian oligarchs who have died in mysterious circumstances since the Ukraine war started. So, there's been a third of them have fallen out of windows or off cliffs. There's been a raft of suicides. Some have died with the whole family's dying as well in break-ins or whatever it is. So, there's people send tweets and then drown a few hours later. Send tweets about anti-war and then drown a few hours later. There's a lot of stuff going on within the Russian geopolitical sense that sort of if you're a Russian oligarch, you've had to be quite careful about speaking out against the war. Given this is now somebody who's risen up. And this is the comments you hear from others saying, be careful not to walk any near any open windows is because of exactly this. And so clearly Prigozhin knew that, and which is possibly why he sort of used this as a bit of a last roll of the dice, or some sort of way to get a bribe or a payoff, some sort of retirement package before he left. But they're playing with very high stakes. All parties involved there. So I might jump actually just quickly to some of our other things before we get on to the investment implications for the macroeconomic investment implications.
All right.
We'll be back with the investment insights very shortly. Nucleus Wealth is an active and passive investment manager. If you like what you're hearing and want some help with the investing, we can do it for you via our active portfolios. Our tactical and core portfolios use the insights shared in this podcast to construct and manage your investment. We blend tactical portfolios to offer our combinations of international shares, Australian shares, government bonds, and cash. We vary the asset allocation with the goal of protecting your capital in times of market uncertainty. We also have active international and Australian share portfolios. These are chosen using our quality and value investment philosophy. You can find out more at nucleuswealth.com. Now back to the show.
All right. Okay, so some of these comments, thanks, John, for them. I'm just going to kick off from the top. So, hi, Damien. Wagner squashed ISIS in Syria. Let's not forget that.
Oh, look, and I think this is absolutely the issue with war stuff everywhere. It's the same argument, I guess, we've been talking about. Is there's always a thing about, okay, you've got to use force to do it, and the cluster munitions are exactly that. You've got to use force. Do I use cluster munitions which are banned by the UN, or do I use them and be in contravention of that and pick up a military advantage, or do I not use them and let the enemy use them? And yeah, this has so many nuances and so many grey areas that's why we want to let individuals make up their own mind with these.
Exactly. Also, let's not forget the Minsk agreement, which was signed by France and Germany and was never enforced by the West. Russia tried to get it enforced for 8 years. Do you want to comment?
No, that's right.
Moving to 2022, Merkle and Holland openly admit that they never intended to enforce the Minsk agreement. This whole war is terrible for my fellow Slavic people, which is prolonged by the West. And he notes he's definitely not a troll, but he does live on a farm. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, right. Okay. I'll sort of leave. I guess what I want to do is leave the moralizing a little bit about which wars are right and which ones aren't. I'll leave that out of it because I think there's. But I do want to get into the
right.
Any right, that's right. But I do want to get into the macroeconomic thoughts of it. So look, in a big picture sense, Russia is pretty much out of the world trade already. They're still trading a lot with India, still trading a lot with China. Is any of the happenings the last week or two going to affect Russia with the West? Look, most probably not. I think there's I spoke about it being there's a lot of instability that's probably going to crop up in some of these countries, and Syria might be a good example. Syria's economy is already decimated, already very little to do with other countries. Yes, it's a terrible thing for more instability, but it's probably most of these. It's probably not going to have a broader macroeconomic effect. You spoke about the U.S. elections. There probably is some element in terms of is there going to be less interference? Probably. There's probably still going to be interference though. So my guess is that at the margin there might be a little bit less interference. The real big implications really is for oil. So the Russian oil industry has the problem that they are running on aging equipment, and they were relying very much on Western oil to keep everything going, and maybe not keep everything going, but fund new expansions. So we saw Venezuela, a decade or two ago, basically cut their production by 80% once they kicked all the international firms out and gave all the running of their oil to basically the military within Venezuela, because even if there were local Venezuelan oil engineers, they tended to want to get out of the country, and they had a very marketable skill. They're an oil engineer. They can go somewhere else and live in another country and not have to worry about the problems with food shortages and all those things. So they saw quite a collapse in the amount of oil that was coming out of Venezuela. That there is potential for that in Russia. So and the more instability you get, then the more you need to worry about that whole oil. That oil is Russia is a major producer. Most of it isn't going to the West, certainly in name. Most of it's ending up in India or China at the moment, but it's still a massive producer in terms of world. And if it stops producing, then India and China need to get their oil from somewhere else, and they're going to compete and bid that price up. it's similar for that in terms of it's not as bad within commodities. So food, fertilizers, some mining, because most of those aren't as reliant upon continual investment. So oil has this sort of relatively unique property in that every year the amount of oil that's coming out drops quite dramatically. So you can have sort of 20% declines in the amount. So you need to keep reinvesting and pumping, creating more capex to keep your oil production steady. Otherwise, it will fall off very quickly. Mining tends to be more sudden. So you manage to keep mining and gradually fall off at very small rates before you run out of, and it's too deep and too expensive, and you stop. So there's that. The agricultural side, probably not too bad, but I do want to note that in particular in the Ukraine, the dam that broke, most of southern there's a lot of grain grown in southern Ukraine, and that dam that was sabotaged was fed a lot of the water to those areas, and so those there's quite potentially a fair amount of food sort of offline for years or decades before that sort of pops back on again.
So price increases in wheat.
Price increases, yeah,
okay.
At the margin. Look.
So not like what we saw when the war started.
So look, I think that the issue is, I guess in a big picture sense, the issue I have with food commodities in particular is it is a very adaptable supply chain, much more so than other ones. So we ran into a lot of supply chain problems, for example, during the pandemic with a lot of different things. Food is one of the areas where, the supply chain in the pandemic, because they weren't used to supply chain collapses and problems happening. Food is one area where we are used to it. There are droughts every year somewhere. There are floods every year somewhere. Things happen in the food industry, and people change between, okay, I'm going to feed my cows grass. Now I'm going to feed them grain. I'm going to feed them corn, or whatever it is. Whatever's out of production, I can switch and use different things. So in a short-term sense, I think a lot of the constraints from the Ukraine war have been largely, certainly when you look at UN food price indexes, they've been largely solved. When you look at food on the shelf, it hasn't, but there's a question about, are there other factors playing into that? But at the farm gate, we've seen prices come back to sort of more normal levels. The issue is there a little bit more inflation coming through from this, in that, whether it's wheat or whether it's something else, whether you, everything just gets a little bit more expensive. There's a little bit less food for the world, and everything gets a little bit more expensive because, farmers somewhere convert some corn to wheat, or convert some soy to wheat, or whatever it is. And everything just sort of, everything moves around a little bit, and every commodity gets a little bit more inflation, over a sort of a medium term. So that's quite possible from this.
I see, yeah.
I think there's within a lot of Russia as well, and the rest of the world. The other macroeconomic one is that we'll get to talking, individual companies with, is the defense budgets of a lot of countries are growing quite significantly, and while that's a benefit for a whole bunch of industries and defense companies, it will come at the cost of something. So, the Soviet Union effectively bankrupted itself trying to produce weapons to compete with the US. It's not producing weapons is not a productive use of your time, and
resources.
You'd probably say resources. Yeah, you'd probably say even more so if you're not using them. But arguably, well, I don't know. Who knows? If you're using them, maybe it's worse. But there is that part about, if you're just if you take a chunk of your economy, and say for somewhere like Poland, I think it's up to about 4% now. So they've basically gone from 1.5 or 2% of your economy, and you're saying, okay, rather than that, actually now I'm going to devote 4% of my economy to making tanks and storing them, and making artillery shells and storing them, so that as a deterrent from other countries attacking me. That's a cost to the rest. That's a cost for others. So there is that flowing through into inflation. So higher inflation as a broad sort of outcome.
So do you think that with the events over the last week that changes the sort of trajectory that we were on in terms of producing weapons?
Sorry.
Is it going to add to the inflation?
A little bit. Yeah, it'll add to a little bit. Look, I think the trajectory was mostly already there. Mm-hmm. Maybe it adds a little bit more to it. Maybe adds a little bit more urgency to it as well, I guess, in terms of shorter term. I had a 3-year plan because I figured that Russia was going to be bogged down in Ukraine for at least the next 3 years, and so I've got a bit of time up my sleeve to if Russia starts to collapse, maybe I need to have some stuff, have my deterrence ready a bit earlier.
Okay.
So yeah, that part, and and from a macroeconomic point as well, we need to highlight again nuclear weapons. Or does that increase the risk premium for the world? And you say, yeah, it probably does at the margin. If it's if we're looking at a bunch of countries, that are quite stable within their political systems, then that arguably gives you a lower risk premium, more steady earnings, and less of a concern. If you're looking at some quite significant countries, some militarily significant countries potentially having breakdowns, then you need to be add a little bit more risk into what you're factoring. So
you need to be compensated for that. Basically, you're taking on more risk if you're investing there. So you should have higher returns.
Yes, in theory. So you should be buying. You want to buy stuff at lower prices.
Okay. So does that change some of the stuff you've been talking about lately in terms of valuations and PEs?
They're already expensive, so it just sort of makes them.
Does it make them cheaper?
Look more expensive. Make them look more expensive now. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you're talking about if we're happy to say the average PE for the ex industrials and resources, ex banks and resources, we're saying the average PE for the world is sort of 16 to 18 times. And you're going through times and you're increasing the risk, then you want to be closer to 16. Whereas if you thought there was no risks, you might be happy to be closer to 18. Now, currently
is that what you mean?
Yeah, in terms of where you want to be buying.
Okay, sure.
Currently, we're at 20, so we're very expensive from that perspective. So it's still a negative. It's potentially more of a negative in terms of what you want to buy.
Thanks.
So that's your sort of macroeconomic thoughts. Is that there's some slight positives, I guess, for some commodity prices. It's negative for inflation, potentially higher inflation that we're looking at, and it's negative in terms of your risk premium. From a military perspective, it's been there's some quite significant changes coming out of the Ukraine war. So it's the first real ground-based war that we've had in decades. It's the most watched or videoed war ever in terms of the amount of footage that we're getting out of drones and helmet cams and all these types of things that are coming out of it. So there is a lot of learnings that militaries around the world are doing. You've had a whole raft of different countries produce new defense white papers and change their spending quite dramatically. Poland was one, was a great example. They are just out buying just reams of equipment. And really changing the way they're doing things. So, and I guess one of the things that's coming through from the Ukraine in terms of how it fits is that the Ukraine was part of the Soviet sort of alliance, and so was Poland. And Poland used to produce a lot of Soviet era tanks and other things, and so a lot of the production was also all within Poland. And so what that meant was. One of the things that the Soviets had was a very extensive air defense system, and that's part of the reason why the Soviets, despite having a much better air force than the Ukraine, hasn't managed to gain aerial superiority over the Ukraine, is because because Ukraine already started with a Soviet era quite high level of air defense. Now, the issue is they're running out of Soviet missiles, and so that's why they're needing to bring in some of the US systems, and are getting increasingly strident about needing more of these systems because they can't produce the equipment. And that's partly where Poland's coming from as well. Is Poland wasn't part of NATO, it was part of the Soviet alliance, and so it's producing sort of Soviet spec weapons. And as they're moving on, they're sending a lot of that stuff to the Ukraine to help out with this, but they're also then trying to buy in, and a lot of the new stuff they're doing is is NATO specific. And so there's a bunch of countries there who are worried about their own safety, and that's why they're out spending a lot of money now, is because a lot of them are converting from, half their stuff under NATO and half their stuff still under these old Soviet systems, to trying to get more NATO things and really secure supply of a lot of this. If Russia decided to attack, say, Poland, which Poland's been attacked by plenty of countries over the years, and so that's why they're very nervous about the whole thing, is that there's a desire to not have to then go and ask Russia for, can we have some more missiles to fill our anti-aircraft missiles to shoot down from you. So so that's coming from there. There's the big thing as well is the wars we've had over the last 20 odd years have really been more about counterinsurgencies, you'd call it. So it's been quite dominant military forces, whether it be countries like France in Africa, or the US in Afghanistan, or Iraq. Really quite sophisticated militaries battling against quite unsophisticated militaries. And so you needed a lot of helicopters, and you needed a lot of these things that could fly people around, and you didn't have to worry about the enemy being able to shoot them out of the sky. Whereas within the Ukraine, helicopters have proven themselves to be, I guess, a relearning of what we've learned from most wars, is they're very vulnerable and maybe not as important as they are during definitely not as important as they are during counterinsurgencies. And then the rise of artillery. So, you didn't need to have these massive artillery units to take out the Taliban in various places. But when you're fighting another army that does have the artillery, then there is now a much higher demand for a lot of this equipment. So the shift in terms of defense budgets away from the things that you would use to solve counterinsurgencies and things that might be deterrents in terms of ballistic missiles and intercontinental missiles and things like that, are now sort of being pushed down in the list of priorities, and is actually saying, do we have the equipment to fight something like we're seeing in the Ukraine? And the answer for most militaries is no. We need to actually go and recast what we're doing. And so we have seen a big change, not only an increase in the budgets, but a change in where that money is being spent. We've seen the arrivals of drones as really hit. Now drones, I want to say, is a pretty encompassing term as well. It goes from your multi-million-dollar drones that you saw taking out, that the US used to take out various things in their wars, down to the couple of $1,000 ones that Ukraine are 3D printing something to strap a grenade to it and fly it into a tank. Now, that has been a dramatic change in terms of the warfare. That's probably the biggest thing that we've seen. And so, that's an arms race. There's quite cheap drones being developed everywhere, and basically strapped rockets to it and fly it into things, or as I said, 3D print grenades. And at the same time, there's this whole electronic warfare, how to jam them and how to communicate, and can you have swarms of these things working together, and how do you have there's a whole anti-drones and how do we create drones, how do we create stuff to bring them down? And
so can I ask, tongue-in-cheek, have we moved from single-use cutlery to single-use drones?
Oh, absolutely. Single-use drones are absolutely okay. So all the ones you might hear about, the Iranian ones that Russia keeps buying, they're single-use drones. Effectively, you strap a bomb to it and you fly it into something. Is the is the process, and they're quite slow and everything, but they're cheap.
So is it possible to build them with like less kind of electronics and also less ability to jam, or maybe they're easier to jam? I don't know.
Well, the idea is you've got to fly it into something. So how are you going to get it to fly into it? What you're looking for? And some of these drones, I think they call them lurkers, where they fly and they circle for a while looking for a high value target, and then they fly them into things. And are they being controlled by somebody with a headset, or are they being controlled by GPS satellites? And so can you jam the GPS? And like there's a whole bunch of these things.
Like, I mean, can you jam a radio frequency?
You can. There's lots. Electronic warfare has got it's taken a huge jump forward in terms of this as well.
Okay.
And so so I guess where I'm getting to with this is where countries are spending money has changed, and there's some, a lot of this stuff is scary from a human life perspective, but it's genuine and it's the sort of new arms race that's going on. So with that, I sort of wanted to jump in to talk about I'll show you some of these budgets that's sort of going on.
Just on that, before you jump into that though, it's you can like or dislike it as much as you want, but the fact is that here today, this is the reality that we face.
Exactly.
Well. That's no value judgment on that or how you feel about things, but it is our reality today.
Yeah, and depending upon whether you support, if you support the Ukraine and think they have been hard done by, or even if you support Russia from the other side, I guess the thought is there are. What is Ukraine doing in terms of trying to generate a military advantage? And at the moment, it is heavy use of drones. And there's even a difference between Russia has got an advantage in drones that more expensive drones that you strap missiles to and fly them into things. They have an advantage in.
You shoot the missile Ukraine, from multi-use drones.
The Ukraine have an advantage in the smaller drones that they're actually much more agile at checking, and using for surveillance and stuff like that because of the way the command and control has been set up. The ironic thing with some of these other drones is that they're literally pulling out World War II artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, to try and shoot down the drones that say the Iranian drones, because they are quite slow and noisy and cheap. But there's an economic war going on as well within that, is that if I can fly a $20,000 drone at you and it costs you $100,000 to shoot it down, or $1 million to shoot it down, then that's an economic war I can keep going. I'll do it again. Maybe you keep spending 5 times as much to shoot down the stuff that I'm sending at you, and I'm going to win, in the long term. And so so there's a whole there's a whole defense argument about it's a whole mix of saying, what am I spending to counter whatever the other person is doing.
Who has the deeper pockets in the Ukraine-Russia war, do you think?
If Trump doesn't get voted in, then the Ukraine.
Okay.
If Trump gets voted in, then Russia.
Yeah, yep.
Would be my assessment. Actually, if Trump gets voted in, maybe Europe would step up. Yeah, it's more questionable, I guess. Yeah, if Trump doesn't get voted in, then I think the answer is unambiguously the Ukraine.
Okay.
I probably wouldn't. I don't know if I'd say Russia the other way, but I'd certainly say it's a lot more questionable.
You don't think Albo maybe wants to step up?
Sorry, who?
Albo.
Yes, I don't think. I think for Australian listeners, Australia's has been lagging behind a lot of the stuff. But it is a good example of what a lot of countries are doing, which is we've got a whole bunch of these. I think it's F-18, so we're not using, and are effectively retired. Maybe we send them all, and so and that's effectively what Poland in a way is doing, is saying, let's take all this old equipment that we've left over from Soviet era and send it to the Ukraine rather than retiring it, and then let's buy new stuff that'll help protect us. So. So I've got a list of some of the large NATO countries up, just sort of showing that the US is still spending truckloads of money and is far and away the biggest in terms of its spending. So it's just what's happening in the US matters more than others. So they have this target of decreasing the amount relative to GDP, but I don't particularly believe that's going to happen. Germany is inching higher. They are looking to increase it by about a third in terms of their spend. I actually haven't got Japan on this because they're not a NATO member, but Japan has dramatically increased its amount. You've got Poland in there that's gone from sort of 2% a few years ago to 4% in 2023.
Can I just ask, the US dollar column, is that millions of US dollars?
That's yes, millions US dollars. So it's
Japan, it's not really related to, it's not as recent as the Ukraine-Russian conflict. They've obviously changed their terms of engagement recently too, right, to expand them.
They have. They have their. I'm trying to remember what the name of the document is, but it's basically that they're not going to be a war. They're going to have defensive capabilities, but not offensive capabilities, and I think they're changing the terms of. They're changing some of the definitions of what is a defensive capability and what's not. And so I think, for example, there's like an aircraft carrier is thought of as an offensive weapon, not a defensive weapon. But I think Japan now has a number of ships that can have that aircraft could land on that are not aircraft carriers, officially aircraft carriers. But
also, sorry.
Yeah.
Have they also expanded their willingness to aid allies from a defensive?
I think there was something as well. I can't remember the exact details of that one. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway,
but Japan's certainly expanding the amount of money they're spending quite dramatically as well as these ones. So that's your large NATO countries. Your large defense contractors. I sort of thought I'd talk through some of those quickly, just to sort of give you a picture of where you can invest. So most of these are US-based ones, but BAE is UK, Leonardo's Italian, Thales and Dassault are both French. The first column I've got here is sort of showing the amount of military sales. So for some of them, for example, Boeing, it's only about half their spending, but yeah, they are still significant because they're so big. It's still a significant amount in terms of dollars. And so that's always the question, for people in terms of where that money's going. Lockheed Martin is sort of the real big one within that, and for anyone who's looking for, I guess some of the heroes, so to speak, from the brand names from the Ukraine side in terms of the Javelins, which is the anti-tank sort of shoulder-armed anti-tank missiles that were quite effective in the early parts of the war. The Patriot missiles, the HIMARS, a lot of these have got significant parts from Lockheed Martin. The thing is with Lockheed Martin is, though, it is so big that those are actually very, very small parts of their overall supply chain. They've got a lot in the aeronautical space, a lot in the helicopter space as well. And that's part which, as I said, helicopters sort of, if you're going to fight a counterinsurgency against people with AK-47s, you want helicopters. If you're fighting against somebody who's got anti-tank or anti-aircraft weapons, you want your helicopters a long way further back from the front line. They're not as involved.
So long term, that's maybe, it obviously depends on each individual war, it sounds like. So if we continue to see this trend of helicopters and aerial being less useful, that's negative for them longer term.
Aeronautical's not necessarily as less.
I said aerial, not aeronautical.
Yeah, but helicopter certainly is one area where.
Do you get a short-term bump as they need to replace the vehicles that have been destroyed? Maybe not doing that.
I don't think there's a lot of helicopters being sold to the Ukraine. No.
Okay.
Sure. No, I don't think so.
And presumably none to Russia now that we have the sanctions on them.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think Russia. No, that's right. Russia was producing a lot of these itself. Okay. The issue is for them is that they were using a lot of parts from others. Okay. And so that's where they've been running into problems now and trying to retool their supply chains. And there was, there is speculation that some of the inflation we've seen in terms of some of the household goods, in particular, there were some washing machines that Russia was buying.
The chips?
They're buying them washing machines for the chips that they could then stick into their missiles. And so, that's a real issue. So for us, one of the key things we're really looking for is the IT side and the surveillance side. Like that's one of the areas that we look upon as a very much a growth area coming out of this. So the two of the companies we own within this. So there's two ways you can invest in this. Within our, if you took a defence contractors tilt within our passive portfolios or even active ones, you get most of these companies within it. If you go within our portfolios, we're looking more at ones like L3 Harris or General Dynamics because they do have quite large exposures to some of that surveillance side.
Can you tell me why you like that side of things?
Oh, the explosion in use of drones and the jamming needs and also just the communication side of we saw at the start of Russia ran into a lot of problems with its communication and had sort of I don't know if you call it a record number of generals killed, but a surprising number of generals killed and senior officers killed because their communications largely thought of because the communications weren't as secure as what they should have been.
Okay, yeah.
And so a lot of this is the whole fog of war, it's hard to tell what's going on. Well, if you've got these systems all talking to each other, then and securely talking to each other, then that's an advantage for you. And also, I think the air defence side is, is one area as well where we feel there's some there's a renewed interest in that area and making sure, and particularly a lot of these countries, a lot of the Eastern European countries that are looking to move off Soviet era air defence and onto other types. And we saw, when the coup was happening, they basically had a group of people with some heavy artillery and a lot of mobile anti-aircraft sort of headed towards Russia and managed to shoot down, I think, seven helicopters and one aircraft in terms just using their mobile artillery. And so it's clear that air defense systems are more important than perhaps you would have thought a few years ago. You didn't really need an air defense system when you were trying to take out the Taliban in Afghanistan, or various people in Iraq wasn't as important. Whereas now it's
they would have liked one, I guess, but
they would have exactly yes.
They couldn't afford it, or they couldn't buy it.
Couldn't buy both a mixture. Couldn't buy it. Couldn't afford it even if they could. But certainly the sophistication of air defense because there's a whole there's a whole change in terms of you have to hit a fast moving missile with another fast moving missile and all the various measures and countermeasures. It's a constantly evolving battle between those. Okay. Yeah. So that's the types of things. So a broad picture of what's being produced. I have a. Let's go before we get onto some of the. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yep.
I just wanted to ask. So I think previously you spoke about how there's quite significant changes in the way warfare is conducted in this specific war from some of the recent ones that we've seen. And so what I imagine when you invest is that when you see changes within an industry like that, you often see winners and losers. Are we seeing the same thing within the defence sector, that some companies are benefiting far more than others?
To a certain extent, the major thing for defence contractors is none of this gets done quick. For example, a lot of countries, turned around and went, "Hey, these HIMARS systems are working really well. We don't have anything that does that. We better grab some."
For those that don't know what HIMARS is.
Oh, HIMARS. Yeah, these are it's basically it's a truck with a bunch of missiles on the back of it. And so when you're firing artillery, what tends to happen, or what the Russians, for example, do, bring their artillery out, set it all up, take some, say, an hour or two to set the whole thing up. Then they start shooting at positions on the other side. Then they pack it up and go away before they get shot back at. The HIMARS is a highly mobile version, and it drives out, shoots, and then runs away before anyone has a chance to shoot back. And so
highly mobile artillery or something like that.
There's so many military acronyms. I'm not even going to try and remember which ones are which. But it's basically a mobile artillery system. And it's been very successful for the Ukraine, and really was the last sort of major breakthrough they had, where they took back a whole bunch of cities. Was a lot of that was attributed to their ability to take out Russian supply lines, 50 kilometers away, because of these highly mobile things, and not have them shot down again. Because ordinarily what you do is you'd bring out your artillery system, and yes, you'd be taking out their ammunition dump, but by the time you'd done that, you've been taken out yourself.
Yeah, right.
So so a whole bunch of countries said, "Yep, great, I really want one of these HIMARS systems. Get me them." And Lockheed Martin basically went, "Well, we're booked up for the next 2 or 3 years, and you know what? The US government's decided it wants a whole bunch more of these as well. And if you're from a small country, then we're producing for the US government first." And so so there's that element. A lot of countries want to do stuff internally, so they want their own production. So you could see, Australia and the whole subs debacle. A lot of that was about getting the manufacturing capacity within Australia.
We didn't get in the end, did we? That was the French contract.
That was the French contract, yeah.
But moved away from that.
But the difference between the amount of money we were spending, so if you basically said, "Oh, I want some subs," and you build them wherever you want and ship them over, the cost would be a fraction of saying, "No, I want you to build it all in Australia and have the capability and stuff like that." Now, the pluses and minuses come from that is that, well, actually, we want to make sure that France is on the same side of whatever we're fighting, and so maybe and we want to be able to make sure if something goes wrong. It's a Ukraine problem. It's exactly the Ukraine problem. They have all these Soviet era air defense missile system, and pretty soon they're going to run out of missiles to run them. And so now they're like, okay, now we actually need to buy a whole different set of missiles and systems to shoot them.
Okay.
So what was I getting to with this? Was actually I wanted to let's jump to the message, and I'll get back to more of the investment implications for stocks.
All right, great.
We'll be back again shortly. If you like what you're hearing but want a low-cost passive option, Nucleus Wealth is the first to offer passive direct indexing in Australia. The first generation of passive investing was index funds. The next gen was ETFs. Now direct indexing is here with significantly more customization and control. The benefit of direct indexing is you can add or subtract investment themes, and we have almost 100 different options to choose from. For example, you could buy an international share direct index portfolio that excludes fossil fuels and arms manufacturers and has a tilt towards cybersecurity and cloud computing. Alternatively, you could buy a portfolio with no screens and an extra exposure to nuclear power and defense contractors. You can find out more at nucleuswealth.com. Now back to the show.
Okay, so valuation-wise, maybe let me jump to that first, and then let's come back to some of the companies, because I think there's a bit within that. So valuation-wise, this is a chart of the aerospace and defense sector, which is, look, it's probably the right one to look at. The problem with it is you do get, say, Boeing and Airbus, where half their revenues or more than half their revenues comes from non-military, and as we saw from the other chart, a lot of those other countries, it comes from non-military sources. So it's expensive. It's sort of 21 times at the moment. Come down a little bit from where it was sort of a few years ago. So it's not relative to the rest of the world. That's the chart on the left, where the rest of the world ex banks and resources. So on that basis, it's about fair value. It's sort of sitting roughly. It's a little bit more than the average over the last little while, but I would say that the outlook is certainly better than in terms of the earnings outlook is more positive than what it was. And I think the stability as well is, I think the other thing that has a number of militaries have commented on is that that it's one thing to say I've got a store of shells of whatever it is, But if you don't have capacity to produce these things, then your store will run out if you get into a concerted conflict, which is effectively what Russia's problem is that they're bringing out, as they call it, Soviet era weapons and Soviet era missiles, because the latest and greatest stuff, they just don't have, they've shot them all, and they don't have the capacity to make as much as what they need. And so, I think there has been a recognition in military circles is actually maybe we need some more consistent orders for some of these companies, so that we're not saying, go and make us 1 million of these things, and then we want 10,000 a year after that. Is actually maybe we're better off ordering 100,000 a year or 150,000 a year for an extended period of time, so that they actually do have a significant amount of capability and potentially can then scale it up at a later stage.
So they're big warehousing them, basically. Is that what you're saying? Stockpiling
Yes,
them.
stockpiling. That
sounds very similar. Not the stockpiling, but before that sounds very similar to what we saw in COVID for gloves and masks. All of a sudden, it's just like deglobalization.
Yeah. It's a point about saying we need to have capability of producing this stuff, and even if it is something where we might be producing something similar on, and we say, but it's in somewhere that it's in a location that is militarily, it's not saying, okay, I'm going to produce all my shells in Korea, for example, or China. And then if something goes wrong and we end up with a war with China, or we end up with a war with China, and even if it's in Korea, which might still be a friendly country, but I just can't get there because, And
so diversity then, supply chain diversity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that within companies themselves, that's that obviously comes with a cost. So I think from what we're seeing, they are looking a little bit more expensive than what we've seen over the last 20 odd years, say. But I think there's enough growth within some of the shares, and that's where I've got the next one to say that they're not so expensive that it'd be concerned about it. So on this next page, we've just got a bunch of the bigger ones as well. We're just showing what our value and quality ranks are for a lot of them. With the nuances, this is a sort of a single number that actually hides a lot of the detail behind. And so, I wouldn't hang everything on that one number. There are nuances that we do get involved with, but you can see that there's a number of there's a lot of green within the quality column. So there are a lot of these companies that have quite stable earnings, make quite solid margins, don't have heaps of debt, and at the moment have got relatively good growth. But something like a Lockheed Martin, for example, is very high quality, makes good margins. It's actually not growing that fast, and partly that was that observation I was making about they had that large sort of quite a diversified range, and even though some of the real brand name things that they have in terms of the HIMARS, so I didn't speak about some of the other, the Javelin shoulder-mounted anti-tank missiles and the Patriot air systems, air defense systems, because they don't have the ability to scale those up really quickly. They actually haven't seen a lot of growth, and they're not that big because the company's so big itself, and they do so much other things. Whereas some of the other companies you are seeing some better growth in, and that's one of the ones we own there within General Dynamics, where we just think that we're seeing better growth, and L3 Harris, where we think we're getting a better mix of a more reasonable valuation plus a certain amount of a reasonable amount of quality within that. And then exposure within the stock itself to a lot of the electronic sort of warfare stuff that we think there is going to be expansion, and not just sort of a one-off. For example, some of the artillery ones, it might be we need a one-off scale up from whatever X thousand per year to 10 times that. Whereas I do think the electronic stuff is going to be an ongoing and growing area for this. So yes, so that's where we're sort of sitting with a lot of the air defense evaluations, the individual stocks. I think I wouldn't say it's look, we think it's well worth having exposure to it within our portfolios. You can knock them out if that's something you don't want to have exposure to. So you just say no weapons, and that sort of clears out any of these ones. And then if you do want to add in extra weaponry, extra defense contractors, you can add that in, and that just gets you a mix of all of them, or all the I think 8 of the largest ones. And that sort of ends up with the, well, actually, I'm going to throw back to you, Shelley, if there are any other questions, and then we'll go to the question of the week.
Yeah, great. So last call for questions before we go to the question of the week. There are none right now. So let's go to that question of the week, and then I'll do one more check. So this is me, isn't it, Damien?
Yep.
Viewer question of the week. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and also, your dialogue with other listeners who've contributed. So please drop your answers in the comment section on YouTube. So if Ukraine is resolved, do you think the commitment to defence budgets will remain? Good one there, Damien. Really interesting.
Yeah, and so that's really the key investment question for all this is that, let's say whatever happens, some sort of general decides that he's going to take over in Russia and Putin's disposed, or Putin even decides that that's it. You know what? I need to focus on internal and I'll pull out and whatever that resolution is, that Ukraine now becomes, okay, it's not an issue. It's not an active ongoing issue. Will you see all these other countries say, oh, okay, now I don't need to spend 4%? Or have they actually seen enough for Sheikh to go, well, you know what, I'm going to need to spend more money for the next decade or so to scale up.
All right. Have you got a view on that, Damien?
Look, I've got a view. Yeah, sure. Look, my view is probably, but I'm not. I guess I'm not intimately aware of all these countries and the political climate in it, and I can see where potentially some of them there might be enough of a groundswell to say no, we don't need to spend this money, but and certainly if Russia wasn't seen as much of a threat as what it is, but at the moment I would say for the next 5 to 10 years that defence budgets are going to be high, and what we've seen in say Japan is probably only very marginally to do with Russia and more to do with China.
Interesting, I guess, point that you touched on there about populations are probably going to have to pay for this in some way, this increased spending. Not probably, they're going to have to, and whether or not they're going to be accepting of that or perhaps react to that and force politicians down different paths. So there's a social aspect, of course, to this. Mm-hmm. So, Damien, thank you for your time today and every week. If listeners want to hear more from you or read more from you, where should they go? What should they do?
So our website's probably the key one where we post all our blog posts. On Twitter, LinkedIn, you can follow me on both those. Facebook, we have an active Facebook page. I believe we've got an Instagram page.
We do have an Instagram page.
It's I'm not as active on that one, but Nucleus certainly have an Instagram page and also a Pinterest page, I think, as well.
Yes, that one is
probably less used.
Least used, yeah. All right, and don't forget 12:30 Australian Eastern Time.
YouTube, yes.
On YouTube every week. Thursday, I was going to say.
Or all the different podcasts, that you can get it from Spotify and Google Music, Google Podcasts and Apple and everywhere.
And that website again, nucleuswealth.com. So if you enjoyed our content, we'd love if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, like the video and click the bell to make sure that you're notified when we do any special episodes or post future content. Also, to help our show grow, we'd love if you know anyone who might get value out of today's episode or other episodes, if you'd share that with them, maybe a friend, a family member or a colleague. And from myself and Damien and the rest of the team at Nucleus Wealth, thanks for watching us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye for now.